Hello and welcome to First Post Live. We're doing a series of interactions with key economic, for current and former economic policymakers as well as experts. We're kickstarting the series today with a conversation with Dr. Bibek Debroy, who's chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Good morning, Dr. Debroy, and welcome to this. It's now 3 months since the PMEAC has been set up, and we've got the second quarter numbers come, and we're going into the budget a month from now. At this point of time, what do you see as the state of the economy, and what are the challenges? How do you see 2018 panning out for the economy?
On the economy, there has been a lot of commentary around the 5.7% figure, and it has often triggered a barrage of gloom and doom. I think that was unwarranted to start off with. The economy was never that bad, and part of what happened with that 5.7% was a slightly technical kind of issue, statistical kind of issue, which had to do with the GDP deflate. The economy is incrementally improving, measured in terms of GDP or GVA growth. The last quarters of this fiscal year should get pretty close to 7%. Last quarter, I'm not talking about the overall year. So 2018-19, probably closer to 7.5 rather than 7. But the band essentially is 7 to 7.5. One of the things one needs to realize is many of the things this government has done, they begin to show results with a slight time lag. Be it the improvements in the transportation sector, the connectivity in the power sector, be it financial inclusion, be it things like RERA, be it things like GST. So therefore, beyond that 7 to 7.5%, which is also contingent on the world economy recovering and doing much better, a fact that people often tend to miss is when India did 9% or thereabouts, the world economy was doing far better, Indian exports were doing far better. So therefore, as I said, incrementally, it is going to seem better.
So you are saying that 2018 will be much better for the economy, and because when the PMEAC took over after the first meeting, the PMEAC had said that had acknowledged that there was a slowdown, and you feel now we're definitely getting out of it, and the indicators that have come till now are not just seasonal blips, and they are a consistent.
No. Let's be a bit careful. As PMEAC, we had never said that 5.7% represented a slowdown. What we had said is there are some things which you can call them a structural issue, which have been happening over a period of time. They did not suddenly surface. Now those structural issues still remain. One can step back and look at it in the following kind of way. Any growth essentially has 4 different sources. One is investments.
Yes.
By which I mean private investments, and indeed there are reasons to be not alarmist but to be a bit concerned about private investments and what is going to be the timeline for private investments to take off, and we can discuss those reasons. The second one is government expenditure. Government expenditure has its limits. Public expenditure has its limits because of fiscal consolidation. One must also remember that about half of capital investments, public, now happens at the level of the states. Yes. So one tends to focus on the union government, one forgets the states. The third source can be consumption expenditure. And there are signs that consumption expenditure is gradually going to improve. But the fourth source is what I indirectly mentioned earlier, which is exports as in net exports. Now, yes, the recent export numbers are a bit better, but indeed there are some issues about whether net exports can provide the kind of stimulus to growth you require to go up to 9%. So in that sense, those structural problems certainly remain, But as I said, there was never any gloom and doom. To the extent that there was gloom and doom, or sentiments of gloom and doom and negativity, soon the news will begin to dissipate that gloom and doom.
You raised these 4 issues, the 4 drivers of growth, and some of these have been part of the 10 priority areas which the PMEAC had listed out for closer look. One of these was definitely government public finances, and the PMEAC had said after its first press conference after your first meeting, that you were not in favor of the fiscal deficit numbers being breached. There seems a likelihood that this may happen this year. Are you concerned about that, and have you flagged that concern?
No, what we have flagged and what we have not flagged is not for dissemination through first post. So let us ignore that point.
Are you concerned about it?
No, because firstly, budget day is not all that far away.
Yes.
So let us wait to see what the numbers are like. Let's also recognize, and I want to stress this point, that union government finances are facing some pressure. Although I also quickly want to mention that the disinvestment numbers, I'm certain at the end of the year, are going to be better than what had been promised in the budget. Having said that, for a large chunk of government expenditure in the short run is given to the finance minister. There's not much you can do about it, be it wages, salaries,
yes,
pensions, interest payments, all of that in the short run. You can't do really very much. You can do certain things on subsidies, but also on subsidies, let us remember there's a food security legislation. On things like MGNREGS, there's legislation. Let us remember the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission and the central sector, centrally sponsored schemes, the revenue compensation to the states. So given all of that, obviously the union government has certain fiscal pressures. For the precise numbers, let us wait till budget day. I think what will be a reason for concern is if there is a significant slippage, which I doubt, and if that slippage is not backed up with an adequate explanation about why it has happened. If there's a credible explanation about the longer term fiscal consolidation exercise, I don't think anyone will get too jittery if it is a matter of 1 decimal point.
Okay. One of the concern areas is on the revenue, because the GST collection figures which have come shows that there has been a drop in terms of what will come to the center. Do you see a slippage mainly on that account?
Partly, all right. Before reacting to GST, let us recognize that revenue, particularly, well, both direct, indirect, and certainly indirect, is also a function of growth.
Yes.
So once the growth begins to happen, then revenue numbers are better. But there is an important point that I want to make on the GST. And I am now not talking about products that are not part of GST, that's a separate issue, nor am I flagging the number of rates.
Though you are concerned about that.
Yeah, we can come back to that. And the right for deciding that vests with the GST Council. But we can come back to that. Let me mention a slightly different point. What is the revenue neutral rate for the GST products that have already been included today? I don't think the numbers exist for anyone to do any calculation. Before that, had you replaced all the indirect taxes with a unified single GST rate, that rate would probably have been, depending on your assumptions, 17-18%, maybe even a little bit higher, maybe even 20%. Today, there is a lot of focus on the 28% rate. I don't think there is adequate focus on the fact that several items have now got exemptions.
Yes.
They are at 3%, they are 0%, so on and so forth. So the point I'm making is, if one were to be able to work out a revenue neutral rate, for which we don't have the numbers yet, I'm inclined to think that the revenue neutral rate would be 14%, 15%, something like that, not higher than that. So the broad point I'm making is there's a lot of fixation. Let's assume there are going to be 3 rates. We don't know what those rates are, but more or less everyone agrees we are not going to get a single rate. We will have 3 rates. Let's assume, for argument's sake, one of them is 6%, one is 12%, the third is 18%. A lot of people focus on the 28 coming down to 18, but we also need to stress that for the 28 to come down to 18, the 0 and the 3 must also go up to 6. And apart from the growth slowdown, I think one of the reasons why revenue under GST has not been as much as was expected is because of these exemptions, by which I mean the lower rates, not products which are outside GST.
Could it also have been because over the past, in October, a lot of the 28% items in the 28% basket were brought down to lower tax, to the lower slabs?
No.
Could the loss
that's perfectly possible.
Or is it only because of the slowdown?
No. It's impossible to disentangle the two. But what I am saying is, if you bring down the 28 to 18, obviously revenue is going to suffer unless you bring up the 0 and the 3 upwards.
Do you see that kind of rationalization happening given the political economy considerations? We are going into an election next year.
No.
Do you think the GST Council will?
I think the election thing is blown up too much, because in a way every year in India is an election year. It's either union government or state level. That's not the issue. The issue is, again, I think it is important to recognize this, that India is the only country in the world. By the way, very few countries in the world have actually implemented a GST. Most countries that have implemented something along these lines are a VAT, not a proper GST. Amongst the countries that have implemented a GST, India is the only country which has a federal kind of GST. Many countries have unitary GSTs, which makes it easier. And therefore, what needs to be flagged is that it is not Finance Ministry which is taking the decisions, it is the GST Council which is taking the decision. And I think we should also applaud the fact that as there were implementational problems, the GST Council tweaked. That, instead of being a criticism, I think should be a compliment to the GST Council. The point that is relevant to the question that you made is, in a sense, there is a perverse incentive for states. And there is a perverse incentive because, in one sense, the revenue compensation has been guaranteed by the union government. Now, if you have a guaranteed revenue compensation, there is no particular reason, elections or no elections, for state governments not to want these exemptions.
Yes, so because there is a point of view among certain economists that, this guaranteeing this 14% revenue was a mistake. Do you believe so?
No, because this
is too high, 14%?
No. This one is not something on which there can be any fruitful debate.
Okay.
There is an ideal GST, whatever it may be, and we are here today. There is no great dispute about what that terminal and ideal GST should be. The issue is about getting from here to there. Now, it is perfectly possible to hang around and wait for another 15 years or 20 years to get the consensus before we begin to move towards that. And there are economists who may subscribe to that point of view, which is what it would have amounted to had one not given the new compensation. Alternatively, one can say that we recognize this is an imperfect GST, but let's begin the process, because we've been waiting for something like 12 years for this to happen. Let's begin the process and then we'll handle it as we go along.
Okay, before getting into slightly more sectoral issues, I want to take you back to the whole issue of growth, because that is going to be the key for a whole lot of other things. What, in your opinion, could be the wild cards that could spook growth concerns in 2018? Could it be oil prices and therefore the current account deficit? Could it be, inflation? What could be points which could trip the economy up?
Implicit in that is an assumption about what the growth numbers are. I said 7 to 7.5%. For 7 to 7.5%, I don't really see anything that could, so to speak, spook the economy. You mentioned crude. Now, whatever prices one has seen of crudes, whatever projections one has seen of crude, they are unlikely to cause a great deal of problems for the balance of payments.
Okay.
So it's not a balance of payments issue. There is an issue of transmission of that higher crude prices to the domestic consumer. And it's not simply a case of petrol and diesel. There are other petroleum products, there is kerosene, there is an issue of rationalizing the indirect taxes, bringing petroleum and related products under GST, there is the LPG issue. So those are issues, but I don't really see higher crude spooking, so to speak, growth of that 7 to 7.5% band in any sense.
But you are in favor of bringing petrol and petroleum products under GST?
I'm in favor of bringing everything under GST.
Okay. Right. Now, one of the focus areas, we went over that, on employment is a source of major concern for the economy right now. And the current QAS numbers which came out recently show that there's been some improvement, but QAS numbers are not quite a very accurate tracker of employment. How serious is the employment challenge, and what are we not doing right? We have not been able to get a grasp on this issue.
You're saying the QES numbers are not a very good indicator, which I agree with. But when the numbers seem to be bad, everyone used those same QES numbers to attack the government.
No, I would have said that even if it had been bad. So.
But again, before responding to this question, there is an issue which unfortunately is not appreciated enough about the quality and the frequency of Indian data, not just on labor and employment, but on everything. And not enough attention.
It's particularly stark in the case of labor and employment,
no,
because
it's true
either
for
you have the
everything.
quinquennial or you have the QES.
No, it's true for everything. It's true for GDP, it's true, which is one of the reasons why we don't really measure the informal / unorganized sector very well. So it's true of everything. Now if this question has been triggered by labor and employment, but I wanted to make that general point. On labor and unemployment, in a country like India, you will never get data of the sort, reliable data of the sort that you get in the developed countries, which is on the basis of enterprise surveys, because very few people in India are in an employer-employee kind of relationship. So that data will have to come through household surveys. And indeed, you're absolutely right. QS numbers are very unreliable. They cover a very small percentage. And it's a sad commentary on the state of affairs that the last proper labor and employment survey data still goes back to 2011-12.
Yes.
So the entire debate about jobless growth, growthless jobs is happening on the basis of data that is now 6 years old. The NSS has begun another survey. The data will probably be out by the end of 2018. Maybe, should be out by the end of 2018. Having said this, the employment issue it has several different angles. The first angle is, of course, the data part, that it cannot be anyone's intention that jobs have to be provided by the government.
Sure.
It cannot happen. So that part is conditional on private investments happening. Manufacturing of the classic kind cannot deliver those jobs, because manufacturing now often is much more capital intensive. Sometimes that capital intensity is triggered by several pieces of policy and law, but fundamentally manufacturing is much more capital intensive. One entry point for job growth, it's not just the quantity, it's also the quality, has been construction, trade, hotels, restaurant, transportation. Those have suffered a little bit. I'm inclined to think that they will sort of improve a little bit. A large part of the focus has often been on people getting jobs.
Yes.
But one of the things that this government and certainly the Prime Minister has flagged quite a bit is entrepreneurship and people actually providing jobs. The next point I would like to make is that a lot of people, even amongst poor households, have invested, within quotes, in education. Once you have invested in education, you no longer are satisfied with the kind of jobs that you used to have earlier, be it in agriculture or be it elsewhere. Or to put it differently, you want higher wages, but the market is not ready to deliver those higher wages for you. So to some extent, and when I say this, I'm often misunderstood, but there's some extent there's been a voluntarily opting out of the job market because I do not have the commensurate skills that the market is expecting from me. It's been more pronounced for women, but it's also happened for younger males. We also have issues of agriculture and creating jobs, employment outside conventional agriculture, commercialization, diversification, agro-related services.
Rural industries.
We have a skills problem. I already alluded to that, because skills is not necessarily the same thing as education. And finally, we have a geographical matching issue, because the demand for jobs is happening in some parts of the country, but the supply of labor is in other parts of the country. So if you go to parts of India, like let's say Punjab or even Haryana now, even Goa, Kerala, people will say we can't get people. On the other hand, you have parts of India where people say we don't have jobs. So there is a skilling problem, there is a matching problem, so it's a basket of problems.
Skilling, there's been a lot of focus on skilling both by the previous government and by this government. Is that something the government can really do in a big way, or is what role can a government play when the job market is changing so fast and so rapidly?
A government can only be some kind of a regulator. A regulator understood in the sense of the skilling problem. A regulator and bringing together prospective employers, prospective trainers, prospective certifiers, and often when we talk about skills, we have a very, very metro kind of bias or urban kind of bias in talking about skills. I would urge people to take a look at what the Ministry of Rural Development has been doing under the skills program for the worst of villages. And I'm not saying it can necessarily be upscaled, because that's a very, very village specific kind of intervention. But those are the kinds of things that the government can do. It is not in the form of public expenditure.
Okay. When it comes to labor and employment, two key sectors which absorb a lot of labor is textiles and leather. Both are not doing very well, and these are both export-oriented sectors also, where they are suffering because of the lack of competitiveness. And Indian exports, though they've started doing well now, we have not been able to capture the market in the same way as smaller economies have. Somehow there's a competitiveness problem, which therefore feeds into the unemployment problem. How can this be addressed? Can the budget address these in some way? Is it only a financial issue? Are there policy, regulatory, cholesterol issues?
Well, you said textiles, but I prefer to use the word garments as opposed to just textiles. Firstly, on the budget part, see, the budget is only one of the policy instruments that the government has. And it's not as if, yes, you are fixated on the one particular day in the year, and we are having this conversation because I'm also partly fixated on that particular day of the year. But it's not as if the other 364 days of the year the government ceases to exist. So many of the issues and many of the policy changes will happen outside budget day. The budget, strictly speaking, under the Constitution is just an annual statement of the Union government's expenditure. There are any number of issues for years and years documenting the problems with garments and leather and other labor-intensive products, and why we have not been able to do what China has done or East Asia has been done. Now, all of those issues one does not need to revisit. They are sort of known. But a question to ask is that competitiveness based on artificial subsidies, I'm saying conceptually, is it based on not paying taxes? Now, I'm flagging this because GST in principle subject to the threshold, brings in people
Yes.
who had earlier not been paying taxes. Now, if I did not pay taxes earlier, but I am now paying taxes, I in some sense lose my competitiveness. That I would say is desirable. Competitiveness is a function of productivity, and it's also a function of the exchange rate. Productivity is low in India, and one of the reasons for that is many of these are small scale. We don't really have the scale that China has or even East Asia has. But one of the issues that probably explains why Indian exports have not been doing well of late is the exchange rate. And on the exchange rate, at a very general level, the issue is very simple. That on the grounds of competitiveness, you would want the rupee to depreciate. But because of capital inflows, and not all of that is portfolio, there is a tendency for the rupee not to depreciate, and so therefore there has been an erosion of competitiveness, and one can gauge this not by looking at the dollar-rupee exchange rate, but the exchange rate vis-a-vis other competing currencies. So this is a real issue.
Do you think the government needs to do anything about this, or should just leave it to...
No. What is the
or
government?
The RBI, exactly.
What is
or
the
RBI.
It is the RBI.
Yeah. Does the RBI need to do anything, or should we just leave things as they are?
The trouble with that is that whichever RBI intervention happens is not without its costs.
Exactly.
So it is not as if it is a costless intervention, and therefore, again, this is an old debate about the extent to which the RBI should intervene in the market, and traditionally the central bank has always said we want to cushion the volatility but not to counter the secular trend. I'm using the secular in a very, very specific sense now. The trouble is it's very difficult to distinguish between volatility and what is a trend. So I would say that any intervention, excessive intervention, is undesirable. There's a completely separate argument, which again let me quickly mention, which is that one needs to broaden the forex market, deepen the forex market, because it's a very narrow market as it stands today.
I want to talk about agriculture. Before that, I want to take you back to the whole issue of private investment. You also concede that there is a problem. It is not picking up at all. Even when it picks up, it then falls again. What are the problems there? Is it just a demand issue? Is it like two of your members are very focused on interest rates?
No.
Where are we not getting the hang of the investment story?
I think one should be a little bit careful. I did not say that private investments are not picking up. There are certain sectors where it is picking up. It has certainly picked up in... The numbers will begin to turn up pretty soon. It has certainly begun to pick up in a little bit of steel. It's begun to pick up in housing, including rather unexpectedly in commercial real estate. It has begun to happen in pharmaceuticals, it's begun to happen in IT related stuff, auto ancillaries. So it's not that it's not happening anywhere. Partly it's a time lag. Partly it's also a fact, and it's important to stress this, that there is still excess capacity in several sectors, because there was over-investment within quotes when growth was very high. Until that excess capacity goes away, there is no particular reason to invest. It is also the case that there were some problems related to private investments, whether it be the NPAs, whether it be the clearances,
the twin balance sheet
problem. Now, all of these will be cleaned up gradually, although the NPAs proper, it will probably take 3 years for them to be completely cleaned up. The government has done some things about not so much the NPAs, but the ones that are stuck in the pipeline, including the dispute resolution procedures. So I don't think the private investment scenario is that bleak, Give it another couple of quarters and I think we will have better numbers. Private investments, actually, domestic private investments, FDI is happening. Domestic private,
it's domestic.
Domestic, it's not that if they have not been happening, but a large part of it is not, most of it is not greenfield investments. It is mergers and acquisitions. And the greenfield investments, I think, will begin to happen once the excess capacity becomes less.
How far do you think interest rates are causing this subdued investment?
I wouldn't say interest rates per se. Interest rates may be important as a signal. Let's recognize that central banks everywhere are cautious. They don't like to experiment. Any central bank would be cautious about inflation numbers, not inflation numbers as of today, but projected inflation numbers, would be concerned about an issue that you yourself mentioned, crude, would be concerned about another issue you yourself mentioned, which is the deficit. There is a committee, the committee in its judgment takes a decision, and I think we should respect that decision that the committee takes. Interest rates, to make a dent, if at all, and this is, I'm just being perverse for the purpose of argument, you need an interest rate cut of 300 basis points, 400 basis points. Is that likely? Would you be doing it if you were the RBI governor? The answer is a flat no. So beyond the signal, the problem is not the price of capital. The problem is there aren't too many people who are willing to go to banks to invest. The issue of price of capital arises only if I go to the bank to invest.
Sure.
The people who are willing to invest are not regarded by banks as creditworthy. Banks are reluctant to lend because of NPAs. So there's a whole battery of problems, I think, which come much before the interest rate.
The government has been taking steps to, address this twin balance sheet problem. Are you satisfied with the results that they've started showing on the ground, and when will we really see them have an effect?
So far as firstly, what the government has said about bank recapitalization has been grossly misunderstood. Firstly, that entire figure is not coming from the budget.
Yes.
And secondly, at no stage has the government, by which I mean the finance ministry, ever said that is going to be an across-the-board capitalization. It is conditional on reforms in the public sector banks, and the finance ministry has told all of us in the public domain that the package will be announced pretty soon. So I think we should just wait for that. Now, there are two kinds of issues connected, three kinds of issues. One is stressed assets, which have not yet become NPAs. And I'm using the word stressed assets, but it's somewhat vague because no one very specifically defines what is a stressed asset. So that is one kind of basket. The second is the creation of fresh NPAs. I think I've already mentioned the kinds of things that the government has been doing to prevent the creation of fresh NPAs. And the third one is the existing stock of NPAs. Now, that is really the problem. The figure is probably not as large as is bandied around, meaning that some of them can sort of be recovered, but the rest of it requires, so to speak, the cliched expression of haircuts by everyone concerned.
Which then creates a whole the other debate about you have corporate loan waivers, and the minute you start talking about farm loan waivers,
that's not
a bad
the
word. That is how it is normally. Any talk of haircuts is pitched as.
No, but what one, I think, I'm surprised First Post has not noticed it, that one of the things that is happening is, but before that let me make a statement, that any competitive environment requires both exit and entry.
Yes, sure.
You can't have exit but not have entry. What First Post has not noticed, and I'm surprised, is now you have exit beginning to happen.
No, I was going to come to that.
For the corporate sector, and also exit beginning to happen for the MSME sector.
Right. Right. No, but what I'm saying is the opponents of any
Yeah, I
talk
know.
of haircut will immediately invite this reaction.
I understand. No, but let's not get into the debate, because in that debate, what unfortunately a lot of ignorant people don't seem to realize is there is a difference between the assets and liabilities of Sita Parthasarathi as an individual and the company that's been promoted by Sita Parthasarathi. So let's not get into that debate.
Since this is always pitched as industry versus agriculture loans, and you talked about the excess capacity and you need private consumption demand, is the rural demand story going to really stay where it is? Because farm incomes are under stress. There is an agricultural distress happening. We can't turn our eyes away from that. Do you think going forward there could be a problem in terms of rural demand, which could then affect?
No, but again, I think one should be careful about blanket generalizations for a sector which is extremely heterogeneous. You said agriculture is in distress, or you used farm, I think. One needs to distinguish between two kinds of people who work in agriculture. Sometimes they may wear both hats. One is people who are landholders, and the other is agricultural labor. Sometimes they may wear two hats because I have a very small plot of land. The distress is not much amongst agricultural labor, because agricultural labor wages have been going up. And in fact, the squeeze that you mentioned is partly because the increases in output prices have not been commensurate with the increases in input costs, which also includes the labor costs.
Yes.
So the squeeze actually is on that kind of farm, landholder kind of income. Also, we get completely the wrong impression if we think that the rural sector is earning a living only from agriculture. Increasingly, a large part of the income is coming from secondary and tertiary activities. Now, I also said that I see signs of construction, housing, etc., transportation, those picking up. So I'm not unduly concerned. I am concerned about the agricultural distress and there's a long list of things you can do for that. But I am not unduly concerned about the impact of rural demand and linking it to GDP, which is what you were tending to suggest.
Okay. The long list of things which need to be done, it's the usual laundry list of agriculture. Do you see action happening on those areas, or will it just continue as it is always?
No. You're positing it almost as a binary of 1-0. It's happening, it's not happening. I don't think we should look at it like that, because agriculture, as you know, is a sort of state subject.
Yes.
And different states have been doing different things. For example, the law on tenancy or leasing of land, some states have already done that. If one talks about APMC, some states have revamped it legislatively, some have done it executively. But one of the things that I think is extremely, extremely important is the eNAM, the portal whereby you can sell.
Which is not working as well as...
It just started. Give it time. Give it time.
Okay.
You see,
that's another debate entirely.
And don't give me the leftist argument.
No,
I'm not saying you are. Which is that the small farmer does not gain. The small farmer does not gain even today.
No. What I'm saying is, apparently in many of these markets, the trading is actually happening physically, which is then entered at the end of the day. So there are problems still there.
It's still there, but it just sort of started.
It's been 1 year, more than a year.
So once it takes off, I think it sort of completely bypasses the APMC and all of that. But going back to agriculture and farm distress, it is really a dry land kind of issue. So I personally think that if you are going to solve the agriculture problem, all of that is commercialization, diversification, consolidation of land holdings, unbundling land rights, all of that is taken as given. But I am making the point that until we solve the water problem, I don't think we will fundamentally be able to solve the agriculture problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I would love to take you up on that, but I think we're running out of time, so I'm going to pull out two quick questions. One is the whole issue of integration of the informal sector with the formal economy. And demonetization and GST are seen as two ways where this is being pushed. But is this a kind of forced formalization? And could it actually lead to more costs in terms of individual units dying out without alternatives? Or is there a less painful way of doing it?
No, any change has costs. Sure. So almost tautologically, I cannot have change that is costless.
Okay, less pain.
No, what is less? It's a very relative expression. If I was selling on the basis of kacha receipts earlier, I will always have that pain. Less pain to me means you allow me to keep the kacha receipt. But this formal, informal, see, everywhere the formal sector is much more efficient.
Yes, of course.
So
formalization is
needed.
There's
It's
no argument
desirable,
about that.
but it's not as if it's suddenly going to happen overnight. It is a transition process. You mentioned GST, which partly is designed to do that, not overnight again. You did not mention RERA. RERA also is an attempt to do that. Now, it's not demonetization per se. It's not demonetization needs to be looked at against the backdrop of a whole lot of things that were being done. But I would say that the entire financial inclusion is part of that. So it's a process, and I think that process is going to happen.
There's no stopping it now, and
but it's an incremental process.
It will be incremental. It will not be sudden. So
no, it can't. Logically, it cannot be sudden.
Okay. Final question: what is your wish list for Mr. Jaitley's?
I have no wish list for Mr. Jaitley. We have wish lists that we convey to the Prime Minister, but they will remain with the Prime Minister.
Okay. So, of the 10 areas which you had listed out, you said you're going to give actionable recommendations on 5. Can you at least let us know which 5 you have given actionable recommendations on?
No. You see, there is a council.
Don't tell us the recommendations.
I'm not telling you the recommendations. There's a council which has 4 part-time members. Mm-hmm. Now, these members volunteered to write these papers. They have not yet written those papers. Once those papers are available, we shall put them on the public domain also for debate. But they have not yet written those papers. In fact, at the last meeting, we did a little bit of rejig, we meaning the members. So the initial papers they are going to write is one on labor and employment, a second one on something we talked about, the quality of data, a third one on the definitions of urban and rural, a fourth one on education and health. These are the things on which they are soon going to write papers. Have I missed out?
Will they be in time for the budget? Or to provide inputs?
No. As I said, we are not fixated on the budget. Mm-hmm. So our thing, the budget is just one particular instrument, as I said. So those papers, no, there's no way they are going to be ready before the budget.
Thank you very much, Dr. Debroy. You have I've tried to, but you've never been able to talk about. You've still refused to tell us anything about the PMESC. Thank you very much, and that ends our Live with First Post. Thank you.